Monday, April 14th, 2025. Just wanted to say thank you to Carol for the letter. Dear Mark, have been deeply grateful for your intrepid research through so many chapters in our lives. I have grandchildren too, and pray that the world will prevail in goodness. Thank you for all you do, and you juggle many many tasks, as we all do. Thank you. Of course, the juggling wouldn't be required if unrealistic things happened, but that's fine. Thank you, Carol, for the card. Thank you for the kind words and the support for the program. I think this world is always meant to be full of challenges and controversy. It just starting to just appear as though we have the capability of imagining a world without all of that. But this is almost like a test program in a way. You know, this is the test. And well, at least according to much Christian doctrine, this world wasn't put here for simple hedonism and everyday enjoyment. That's a weird way of responding to it, but I just think that, you know, from one generation to the next, we just need to be role models on trying to take the high road, on doing things a little bit better. It's just going to be one generation to the next. If all of the challenges and the nasty things that, you know, I talk about here, or you see here, or see on other programs and unearthed, or in your own reading, etc., if all those things went away, something else would come in. So this isn't to say, you know, once we solve these problems, everything's all set, and then it's just it's nothing but cupcakes. And I don't even like cupcakes. I don't know why I say that, but anyways, thank you much for that. Anyways, this 280 series, we're narrating the book Germs by Judith Millier, which came out on September 7th, 9th of the year 2001. Again, just a few days around September 11th, just before September 11th, 2001. And as we've been playing the Amazon audiobook, which I'm going to be going back and forth to here, we've learned that huge chunks of the audiobook were missing. Sometimes 20%, sometimes 40% or more of chapters. By the way, the preface itself was completely missing from the audiobook. And initially, I didn't really think much about it. I'm like, okay, you know, what are they going to do, right? Read the bibliography and read all the footnotes. I mean, come on, it's the preface. Big deal, right? But then going back into the preface and then realizing the very first line of the book in the preface, it just sets the tone. In December 1997, 6 years after the Persian Gulf War, the Pentagon announced that it had decided to vaccinate its 2.4 million soldiers and reservists against anthrax. You can learn a lot about a book by the first sentence. Sort of like, you know, you learn a lot from someone when you first see them. You know, what's their handshake like? What's the first question someone asks? How does someone kick off a blind date? I don't know. We're prone to making mistakes and being awkward and so on. But that's a weird first sentence to go straight to that, because that's exactly what my hypothesis has been, is just how important the vaccination program was. It's the science. It is the discipline. It is the advancement of tools which make further understanding of the human genome possible. All of that is involved in that. And there might be more as well. Okay, so Chapter 4 is called Saddam, and it starts on the September 7th, 9th, 2001 book or PDF that you can download on Houstonic.live. Saddam starts on page 139. Chapter 2, 3705. Okay, so Chapter 2, 3705.
Saddam. In September 1990, a researcher breathing through a respirator and clad in protective gear, head-to-toe suit, 2 pairs of gloves, and 2 pairs of boots, walked into a laboratory at Fort Detrick and injected a rhesus monkey with enough anesthetic to render it unconscious. As the monkey's breathing slowed, she moved the monkey to a plexiglass box, placed its head in a rubber-lined enclosure, and turned on an aerosol device, which released a carefully measured dose of Bacillus anthracis, the microbe that causes anthrax. The germs were Volume 1B, the same strain sold to Iraq.
The particles of the aerosol mist measured about 1 micron, ideal for lodging into the lungs.
One by one, 60 monkeys were infected and returned to their cages. The experiment, one of the most ambitious ever attempted at Fort Detrick, had an unusual practical urgency. Saddam Hussein's army had invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, and American intelligence agencies believed that his arsenal included germ weapons. The experiment was designed to find out which treatments offered the best protection after an anthrax attack: antibiotics alone, vaccines, or a combination. Years of neglect had left American forces vulnerable. None of the soldiers or reservists serving in the military had been inoculated against anthrax or other well-known biological threats, despite accumulating evidence of wide Soviet preparations for germ warfare. The Pentagon had no plans for how it might surge production of vaccine in a crisis and had little of it on hand. Even more significant, the armed forces lacked equipment to detect attacks with germ weapons such as anthrax, which takes hold in the body over several days. By the time a patient infected with Bacillus anthracis becomes feverish, the first sign of the illness, it is often too late. The scramble at Fort Detrick to study possible treatments of the disease was only one sign of how much was lacking.
The experiment took place at Building 1412, not far from where American scientists had spent the 1950s and 1960s perfecting germ weapons. A specially designed ventilation system kept the air pressure slightly lower than the outside air, an arrangement known as negative pressure. If any microbes were accidentally released, they would be sucked back into the lab. Technicians followed stringent rules for the handling of deadly organisms, obeying practices required in biosafety level 3 laboratories. Only hot agents like Ebola, for which there is no treatment, are handled more carefully. The researchers knew surprisingly little about how to combat anthrax. The studies leading to the Food and Drug Administration's approval of the vaccine in 1970 involved only a handful of people afflicted with the inhaled form of the disease. Studies suggested that short courses of antibiotics were ineffective, but Arthur M. Friedlander, that's Friedlander, the chief of the bacteriology division at Fort Detrick, had a hypothesis that large doses of antibiotics administered for at least a month would vanquish the disease. Researchers divided the infected monkeys into 6 groups. One group got the vaccine alone. Another received the vaccine and antibiotics. And 3 groups were treated for 30 days with antibiotics: penicillin, doxycycline, and ciprofloxacin, otherwise known as Cipro. A control group of 10 monkeys received saline injections every 12 hours. Days after they inhaled their first spores of Bacillus anthracis, the monkeys in the control group began to lose their struggle with the disease. Their final hours offered a grisly proof of the microbe's lethal power. By day 8, all but 1 were dead. 2 days later, 8 of the 10 monkeys given the vaccine alone had died as well. By contrast, the monkeys treated with daily antibiotics survived into the 4th week. The experiment was exhausting, a staggering exercise in logistics. One of the antibiotics in the study could be administered by injection, but the other 2 could be given only in oral form, which meant the monkeys had to be anesthetized twice a day and fed the drug through tubes threaded down their mouths and into their stomachs. Every dead monkey was immediately autopsied. Friedlander marveled at the intensity of the teamwork. Researchers are solitary sorts, preferring to work alone or with a cadre of trusted colleagues. This experiment involved more than 60 scientists and technicians. The monkeys were anesthetized more than 3,700 times, and the technicians took more than 1,000 blood cultures to chart the progress of the disease. Friedlander said, quote, "It was an extraordinary effort, a very frantic time," unquote. The military kept a close eye on the experiment. Friedlander went on to say, quote, There were people calling on a daily basis, such as generals from the Pentagon asking, "What happened today?" unquote.
After a month, the results of the experiment were in, and they deepened the dilemma facing General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, the field commander of the Allied army assembling in Saudi Arabia. 30 days of antibiotics had prevented anthrax in most of the monkeys. But the anthrax spores, which can hide for weeks in the lymph system, proved resilient, and there were some differences among the antibiotics. 3 of the 10 monkeys who received penicillin died after the treatment was halted. Those given doxycycline, or ciprofloxacin, fared better, with only 1 monkey in each group dying of anthrax after the treatment stopped. The combination of vaccine and doxycycline performed best, with all monkeys surviving through the months after the experiment ended. The study included a significant proviso. Every monkey had begun treatment within 24 hours of exposure. The message seemed clear. A month of antibiotics improved a patient's odds, but were not a complete solution. Even the newest and most effective of them, doxycycline or ciprofloxacin, eventually failed in about 10% of cases. That would potentially mean tens of thousands of casualties if a large group of soldiers was attacked. The best defense against germ attack, the experiment suggested, was inoculating the troops before they set foot in the Persian Gulf region. If that wasn't possible, and it almost certainly was not given the shortage of vaccine, Allied forces could feel confident in the face of the anthrax threat only if they could administer antibiotics and vaccine within a day of attack. They needed 3 items: detectors that could warn immediately of exposure, large reserves of vaccine, and enough antibiotics to treat every soldier for at least a month. Antibiotics could be found on the global market, but the technology to detect airborne anthrax spores was in its infancy and would almost certainly not be available before the January 15, 1991 deadline set by the United Nations for Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait. Prospects for boosting supplies of vaccine by that date were equally clouded. The facilities at the Michigan Department of Public Health could not come close to bridging the gap. American industry had met such challenges before, but speeding up production of a drug was not like ordering a defense contractor to punch out more tanks or mortars. A new vaccine factory would need FDA approval and would have to comply with strict rules for making drugs, a process that takes years. Schwarzkopf had begun to worry about the Iraqi threat months earlier, soon after he took over the Central Command, or CENTCOM, which was responsible for defending the Persian Gulf.
In a war game in late July, his commanders rehearsed how they might respond to an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The exercise, codenamed Internal Look 90, made clear the logistical problems an American force would face fighting a war halfway around the world. Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons rated a brief mention. None of the participants explored the question of how the war might be affected by an Iraqi biological arsenal. Days after the Iraqi invasion, Schwarzkopf and a delegation of Americans asked King Fahd of Saudi Arabia to accept the deployment of hundreds of thousands of American troops on his soil. The king agreed, and as the American delegation flew over Egypt on its way back to the United States, Schwarzkopf's mind was racing over the challenges of assembling a credible force in the desert. He picked up a secure telephone and placed a call to his chief of staff, General Robert B. Johnston, who was in the headquarters of the Central Command in Tampa, Florida. Schwarzkopf ran briskly through his list of pressing issues.
As he moved the command's headquarters to Saudi Arabia, he included in his list of pressing issues the following statement: "In all directives and orders, include that we must be prepared to fight in a chemical environment." Aides took Schwarzkopf's order as shorthand. Chemical in military parlance means chem-bio, chemical and biological weapons. Intelligence analysis of Iraq's biological capabilities began to circulate more widely at the Pentagon.
On August 6 of 1990, the Navy sent its commanders a message warning that Iraq might have germ weapons that could be effective against ships at distances up to 25 miles. The initial assessment, the message said, was the Iraqis, quote, would deploy these agents if needed, unquote. Analysts at the Armed Forces Medical Intelligence sent around a report summarizing the threat. The report stated that Iraq has a mature offensive biological weapons program, and substantial amounts of botulinum toxin likely have been produced and are probably weaponized. In addition, Bacillus anthracis, or anthrax, Vibrio cholerae, or cholera, Staphylococcus enterotoxin, or SCB, and Clostridium perfringens bacteria, or its toxin, may be in advanced stages of development or available for weaponization.
The analysts delivered a simple message. American troops could be badly hurt by germ weapons. Top officials at the White House and the Pentagon, struggling to assemble an international coalition against Baghdad, were scarcely aware of the issue. But in the less traveled corridors of the Pentagon, the men and women assigned to supply the troops and protect their health understood immediately. In early August 1990, Army health officials spelled out the dimensions of the problem to General Schwarzkopf's aides. The Army had only 10,000 doses of the anthrax vaccine on the shelf. Even if the supplies were stretched by giving each soldier only 2 or 3 shots, the Army had enough to protect it better.
Okay, this is really different. I don't know what to do here. I'm just going to read it, figure it out later. Intelligence analysts. The document noted that Baghdad had several options for delivering germ weapons, from aerosol generators that could be carried on trucks, boats, or helicopters to cluster bombs, spray tanks for high-performance aircraft, artillery shells, and missiles. The gloomy prediction included one bit of reassurance. Quote, "It is assessed that Iraqi forces will use biological weapons only as a last resort," unquote. At about the same time, the CIA weighed in with a report entitled Iraq's Biological Warfare Program, Saddam's Ace in the Hole, which waffled about the issue of whether Baghdad had yet turned its noxious germs into usable weapons. The report said that Iraq's Advanced and Aggressive Biological Warfare Program, or BW, is the most extensive in the Arab world. It also said that by the end of 1990, the Iraqis will probably have deployed significant numbers of biologically filled aerial bombs and artillery rockets. CIA analysts quoted Saddam Hussein as telling a delegation of United States senators earlier in the year, and this would be in the year 1990, that he would use chemical weapons in retaliation for a chemical or nuclear attack on Iraq. The report said that Iraq will treat biological weapons similarly in our judgment, and probably save its biological weapons as a retaliatory option. The analysts raised the possibility that Iraqis might try a sneak attack. It said Iraq may have contingency plans to use biological agents covertly, and botulinum toxin and, to a lesser degree, anthrax bacteria lend themselves to covert dissemination because even small amounts placed in the food supplies are sufficiently toxic to kill large numbers of people. Iraq also could covertly use spray tanks or aerosol generators purchased for its chemical warfare program to create large toxic clouds of bacterial agents upwind of a target area. Narrator's note makes you wonder what direction the wind blows in Manhattan. Stripped of technical language, the analysts delivered a simple message. American troops could be badly hurt by germ weapons. Top officials at the White House and the Pentagon, struggling to assemble an international coalition against Baghdad, were scarcely aware of the issue. Okay, it mentions all this. On August 8th, a day after the first American forces began moving to Saudi Arabia, experts from the Army Surgeon General's office briefed General Gordon Sullivan, the Army's Vice Chief of Staff, on the germ threat. They recommended immediate inoculations against anthrax and botulinum with the stocks on hand. As more vaccine became available, more soldiers could be immunized. 3 days later, a Pentagon logistics officer called Fort Detrick to ask how much anthrax and botulinum vaccine could be sent to Saudi Arabia. The query was seemingly routine. America's armed services stockpile every imaginable item, from fuel to food to ammunition to body bags. Surely the government had ample amounts of vaccine against the two germ agents Iraq was known to be producing. The answer was not reassuring. The United States had vast amounts of vaccine against several diseases, including some obscure viruses, but almost none for anthrax or botulinum.
In early August 1990, Army health officials spelled out the dimensions of the problem to General Schwarzkopf's aides. The Army had only 10,000 doses of the anthrax vaccine on the shelf. Even if the supplies were stretched by giving each soldier only 2 or 3 shots, the Army had enough to protect at best a few thousand soldiers. Army officials rushed to Michigan to assess whether the Department of Health could step up production. The laboratory had been pushing to fill the Pentagon's 1988 order for anthrax vaccine even before Iraq invaded Kuwait. It had 140,000 doses that could be ready to ship by late September, enough to protect about 46,000 soldiers. The pace was ahead of schedule, but it was nowhere near enough to immunize the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would be assembling in Saudi Arabia. The military's choices for protecting its troops against an attack with botulinum were even more limited. Botulism is extremely rare, and American drug companies lacking a market had never paid the considerable costs of putting the vaccine through full clinical trials. Tests suggested that it was safe for humans, but the larger-scale studies, which researchers rely upon to uncover less common side effects, had never been done, even though the vaccine had been around for more than 2 decades. The drug was experimental. Under federal rules, it could not be given to patients unless they gave informed consent after learning of all the possible risks. Stocks of the vaccine totaled just 34,000 doses, enough for no more than 10,000 soldiers.
Narrator's note: can you see the parallels between this and COVID-19? Can you see the parallels of it hasn't been tested, but it's urgently needed? Can you see the parallels of it's going to take a long time for the FDA to approve of it? Can you see the parallels of how are we going to make this older vaccine fast enough? Consider the fact that this is 1990. This is less than 4 years after the Childhood Vaccine Act, which created a parallel system of reimbursement for injuries caused by childhood vaccines, and potentially created a scenario which encouraged drug companies to make products available without sufficient quantity of testing. And here we are saying the testing is going to be very expensive and it's going to take too long. This is just a few years. This is 4 years, less than 4 years after that. And I put forward the likelihood that these things are connected, and the Childhood Vaccine Act was merely a progression, was merely a step towards this. Another side note, recall my video yesterday. Consider this episode of the Autism File, where the founder and main editor of the Autism File, Polly Tomy, actually compared potential risks and injuries from the MMR vaccine, which is a childhood vaccine, to the anthrax vaccine. And this would be the early generation, or this Bioport, Michigan vaccine, the old anthrax vaccine, not the new one. And then again, consider the fact that Polly Tomy of Autism File of Children's Health Defense has been partnering for several years right now with a Dr. Meryl Nass, who is a defendant, if you will, or a hero of championing the rights of U.S. military personnel who are being asked to take the old anthrax vaccine. These are coincidences that are too hard to ignore and overlook.
On August 20th, Pentagon health officials pulled together a committee of experts. Its members amounted to the government's brain trust on biological weapons, an assortment of doctors, intelligence specialists, and mid-level military officers who understood the issue. Their title was appropriately wonkish: the Ad Hoc Working Group for the Medical Defense Against Biological Warfare. The site of their meeting was revealing. Proximity to power is a status symbol in military culture, with top defense officials competing for the coveted offices in the Pentagon on the E-ring near the Secretary of Defense. The ad hoc committee gathered at the Army Surgeon General's office in a building on traffic-clogged Leesburg Pike, miles from the Pentagon. The meeting quickly got down to business.
The intelligence analyst who had drafted the June 1988 report on Iraq's purchases of germs from an American company reported that Baghdad's most advanced germ efforts involved anthrax and botulinum. Army medical specialists reviewed the difficulties in diagnosing inhalation anthrax, which begins with nonspecific symptoms like fever and fatigue. The disease is virtually 100% fatal if left untreated, they said. Botulinum is easier to recognize. Victims suffer severe neurological problems within hours, but harder to protect against. There are 7 strains of the toxin. Iraq had obtained the seed cultures for the F strain, a variant not covered by the small amounts of vaccine the United States had on hand. The committee moved briskly through the material, speaking in the clipped shorthand of scientific professionals. Everybody knew what needed to be done.
By 4 p.m., when they adjourned, the officials had agreed on a far-reaching recommendation. The United States should immediately begin vaccinating troops sent to Saudi Arabia, using available supplies to protect those most at risk.
Out in the desert, General Schwarzkopf and his troops were spooked by a more practical problem. An Army major scouting out landing sites for the Air Force's giant C-130 transport planes came across the carcass of as many as 1,000 dead sheep and goats in varying states of decomposition. Was it a germ attack or just some very sick livestock? The Army did not take any chances. On August 30th, General Schwarzkopf's staff sent a 3-man team for a first-hand look at the rotting remains. A Saudi chemical officer accompanied the team to conduct his own investigation and to translate for the Americans. He proved superfluous. The local Bedouins had hired shepherds from Bangladesh to mind their flocks, and the interviews were conducted in English. The team quickly concluded that the sheep and goats had died from natural causes. The shepherds said they themselves were in fine health. The problem was simple. Animals in the region were not properly vaccinated against indigenous diseases. Reports of the false alarm reassured officials in Washington, where the proposal to inoculate soldiers was gaining support.
The top medical officers of the Army and the Air Force endorsed the plan, as did Enrique Mendez, the Pentagon's senior civilian official on health issues. The Armed Forces Epidemiology Board urged anthrax vaccination as soon as possible, reflecting the medical consensus. Mendez drafted a memo for Dick Cheney, the Defense Secretary, ordering the inoculations to begin. Cheney and General Colin L. Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Schwarzkopf all believed that the recommendation needed more study. The plans envisioned keeping any vaccination program secret, but Saudi Arabia was crawling with reporters, and the inoculation of large numbers of troops was certain to leak out. The vaccinations would also complicate the administration's most important diplomatic initiative, assembling an international coalition against Saddam Hussein. The United States did not have nearly enough vaccine to protect its own soldiers, let alone those of its allies, the American civilians living in the country, or Saudi civilians. On September 21, 1990, Powell met with the commanders of the nation's armed services in the Tank, the sealed, spy-proof conference room in the Pentagon reserved for the regular meetings of the heads of the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. The Joint Chiefs decided it would do more harm than good to begin vaccinations immediately. Contradicting the intelligence analysts, they concluded that the threat was tenuous. There was no confirmation that Iraq had figured out how to turn the germs it was producing into weapons. A memo written after the meeting succinctly summarized the outcome. The decisions were no longer medical in origin. Rather, they were political, social, and military operational. This did not mean that Powell was taking the threat of biological warfare lightly. A career infantryman, Powell was far more worried about Iraq's germ arsenal than its chemical weapons. American soldiers, he felt, were prepared to defeat a chemical attack. They had trained for it, had practiced combat operations in suits and masks. You can deal with CW, Powell said in an interview years later. Chemicals don't linger. You can get out of their way. I knew how to handle it. The Allied germ defenses, by contrast, were improvised, drawn up on the fly. BW was a wild card, he recalled, something I had less ability to deal with. The situation did not surprise Powell. I'd been kicking around 30-odd years, he said. I was quite aware that we did not have protective equipment or vaccines. Powell picked Brigadier General John Jumper, a one-star general working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to serve as his personal emissary on the issue to push the production of vaccine and detectors. Jumper told Powell, "Sir, I think you've got the wrong guy. I'm just a dumb fighter pilot from Paris, Texas. I've got a degree from VMI in electrical engineering. I don't know much about this." "Don't worry," said Powell. "You just have to know how to fix things." Jumper set out to educate himself. He quickly learned that the Michigan Department of Public Health was the nation's only licensed producer of vaccine against both botulinum and anthrax. An antidote to botulinum, known as antitoxin, could be extracted from the blood of horses or other animals exposed to the disease. But the United States had only one horse, named First Flight, that could produce the medicine, an experimental drug that had been given to only a handful of people. Jumper found a picture of the horse and mounted it on an easel for one of his briefings of the military chiefs. "This," he declared, "is the entire industrial base for production of botulinum antitoxin in the United States." The generals reacted with disbelief. Jumper received briefings from expert after expert. What surprised him most was the military's lack of a doctrine for biological defense. There had been no planning for how to handle casualties, where to put detectors, or who would be inoculated. It wasn't even clear that there would be any detectors. For decades, the Army had been trying to design equipment that could sniff an aerosolized cloud of germs and provide immediate warning of a germ attack to soldiers. Scientists had not come close to conquering the technical challenges. The air is filled with biological material from pollen to germs. No one could figure out how to design a machine that could distinguish between the normal background and germ weapons. A 1970s Army system, a gigantic air-sniffing device coupled with a crude detector, had been shelved because of its limited accuracy. Shortly after the Iraqi invasion, Powell ordered the Defense Nuclear Agency to improvise a detector that could be mounted on an airplane. The initial tests were encouraging, but the plans were shelved when the prototype airplane was destroyed in a crash. The vaccine shortage worried the Pentagon's top civilian health officials. Peter Collis, an emergency room physician who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, pressed the ad hoc working group to find other sources of vaccine production. He decided the group needed a more inspiring name. Collis, who had studied infectious diseases as an Army doctor, remembered from medical school that anthrax spores were unusually persistent and that the illness could be contracted from household items, even a shaving brush. The best shaving brushes were made from the hair of badgers. The ad hoc working group for the medical defense against biological warfare became Project Badger. "You can't do that," an aide said, reminding him of the Pentagon's procedures for code names. "I just did," said Collis. The team included Anna Johnson Weiniger, the civilian official who had tried to build the stockpile of anthrax vaccine through the late 1980s. She was a natural choice for Project Badger. Pentagon officials were baffled by why the pace of production could not be accelerated. She tried to explain. The conversations were frustrating to both sides. "Just call them up and tell them to deliver 500,000 doses next week." "Sorry, can't do that." "Well, money's no object. It's not a matter of money. They can make 3 times as much as they used to by putting on 3 shifts of workers a day. What do you want them to do, stand there and watch the bacteria grow?" Johnson Weiniger explained the basics to her uniformed colleagues. The only way to speed up production was with multiple assembly lines, which would have to be certified by the FDA. The vaccines had to be processed, tested for potency and sterility, and packaged. The schedule could not be truncated. Every major pharmaceutical company in the United States was approached for help. The responses were discouraging. Producing anthrax vaccine posed special problems. Its spores were so dangerous and so long-lasting that buildings and fermenters in which the vaccine was made could never be used for anything else. Making botulinum vaccine was an even greater production challenge. The microbes had to be grown in an oxygen-free environment. There were 7 different strains, each requiring its own fermenter and production line. Botulinum antitoxin, refined from the blood of horses or other animals, posed its own problems. It took months of repeated exposure to the biological poison to stimulate the immune systems of the animals. Project Badger set out to supplement the production of the Army's lone horse, First Flight, by placing orders for 100 horses that were to be kept in paddocks at Fort Detrick. The experts knew it would be as much as a year before the first lots of antitoxin could be refined and purified from the Army's herd. Of the 150 companies Johnson Weiniger approached to make anthrax vaccine, only 15 owned the appropriate equipment, and only Lederle agreed to try producing it. Collis tried calling the CEOs of pharmaceutical companies himself, telling them the Secretary of Defense had personally authorized him to make the request. The results were no better. Part of the problem was the deal Collis and the Project Badger team was offering. The Army had decided not to indemnify the companies against lawsuits, even though vaccine makers faced huge potential liabilities from people who suffer severe reactions to the drug. At a meeting in early October, the Project Badger team promised the Army that it would have significantly more vaccine available by April 1, 1991. Colonel Harry Dangerfield, a senior member of the committee, viewed the commitment as optimistic. Any vaccine for American troops would be inspected by the FDA, which often rejected entire lots. Producing mass quantities of anthrax or botulinum vaccine would take close to a year, not a few months. We were faced with a problem that couldn't be solved in the time frame it needed to be solved, he said later. The people setting the goals just didn't understand what the issue was. Within weeks of the invasion of Kuwait, intelligence reports about Iraq's biological program were circulating among more senior officials in the Pentagon. One of those officials who felt particularly frustrated by the report's carefully hedged language was I. Lewis Libby, a trim, boyish lawyer and one of the Pentagon's top policy officials. His job as deputy to Paul Wolfowitz, the Undersecretary for Policy, was to think 2 or 3 steps ahead on the international chessboard. Where was the next hot spot? What could be done to head off trouble? What were policymakers overlooking as they coped with the rush of day-to-day crises? To Libby, the words probably and possibly jumped out of the reports about Iraq's biological program. He thought the analysis was cogent as far as it went, but it left open the most important questions about Iraq's intentions. Libby knew the United States had few spies inside Saddam Hussein's secretive regime who could provide so-called real-time intelligence. The reports on biological weapons drew largely on satellite photographs of suspect sites, snatches of intercepted telephone conversations, and interviews with Western businessmen who had sold equipment to Iraq. Libby told colleagues that intelligence analysts had an unfortunate habit. If they did not see a report on something, they assumed it did not exist. Or, as another veteran intelligence officer put it, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. A few weeks after American troops began gathering in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, Libby assembled his top aides to coordinate defense against biological warfare. His instructions were simple. If we go to war and Saddam uses biological weapons, I want to be able to look in the eyes of the soldiers and their families and say, we did everything we could. He asked an aide, a career Navy officer named Captain Larry Sequist, to look more closely at whether Saddam really had a usable germ arsenal. Sequist, who had commanded the battleship Iowa, proved an inspired choice. Navy captains are trained to be generalists who can master the interlocking complexities of complicated engineering systems. Sequist's skills as a quick study served him well. He was not afraid to dive into the unknown. Learning about biological weapons was no different from what he had done all his life in the Navy. In his view, you just had to start asking the right questions and keep at it. In late September 1990, Sequist and another officer who reported to Libby, Colonel George Rock, flew to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio for their education in biological warfare. By the end of the day, Sequist and Rock were reeling. Biological warfare could be just as deadly as a nuclear attack, if not more so. The implications for the conflict in the Gulf were immediately clear. Saddam Hussein had the means to inflict catastrophic, Hiroshima-sized harm on the Allied forces with a single well-planned attack. The two military officers drove their rental car back to the airport, struggling to digest what they had learned. Their conversation continued in the departure lounge, where they became so absorbed that they missed their return flight. Sequist asked intelligence officials in Washington more detailed questions. The scientists at Wright-Patterson had said biological weapons could be easily disseminated from aerosol sprayers used to apply pesticides. Did Iraq have an ample supply? Yes, they replied. In the spring of 1990, the Iraqis bought 40 top-of-the-line aerosol generators from an Italian company. Each one was capable of dispersing 800 gallons per hour. They were compact enough to fit on the back of a pickup truck, small boat, or single-engine aircraft, and could disperse either liquid or dry biological agents. Sequist looked over the weather charts for the Saudi desert. On 3 to 5 nights a week in the fall, he noticed, there was a temperature inversion, meaning that a layer of hot air sat atop the cool air near the ground. Sequist understood the significance. Inversions make biological weapons much more deadly because they trap a cloud of agent over the target. He did some more calculations. Assume the United States had 200,000 troops camped out in Saudi Arabia. If the Iraqis could slip a single small boat equipped with an aerosol generator into the Persian Gulf, it could unleash a cloud of anthrax that would, in appropriate weather conditions, kill 90% of the soldiers. Sequist had made a crucial leap, one that would elude some of his more senior colleagues. The distinctions in the intelligence reports between producing large quantities of an agent and turning it into a weapon were not as important as they appeared. In germ warfare, the germ was the weapon. Saddam's engineers did not need to invent a workable biological missile or shell. The aerosol generators they bought in the spring of 1990 would do just fine. And then there was the terrorist threat. Sequist and Libby hauled in the intelligence officials for additional briefings. What if Saddam Hussein announced just prior to war with the United States that he had 5 containers that would release biological weapons in Washington? Could he do that? You bet, came the answer. Sequist spelled out his conclusions in a highly classified memo for Libby and Paul Wolfowitz. The United States was vulnerable both at home and on the battlefield.
Libby, usually known as Scooter Libby, believed it was possible but not likely that Iraq would use its germ weapons. Saddam was under less pressure than it appeared. In Libby's view, he could survive a defeat in Kuwait. The day after the fighting ended, Libby told colleagues Saddam would still command the only army in Iraq. To deter the Iraq leader from a germ or chemical attack, the United States needed to threaten something that Saddam treasured. For example, his hold on power. Cheney was briefed on Sequist's findings, and senior officials began discussing how to send an unmistakable message to the Iraqi leader.
Josh Lederberg, too, was worrying about the potential threat to civilians. Saddam Hussein's statement earlier in the year that he would burn Israel with his fire was widely taken as a threat to use chemical and biological weapons. As a member of the Defense Science Board, Lederberg had access to some of the classified intelligence on the Iraqi biological program. I knocked on every door, got to see Brent Scowcroft, got to see the intelligence people, the FBI, he said. He also asked a simple question. What are we going to do about the civilian population? No one had thought through which government agencies would respond to a domestic germ attack. Lederberg urged Scowcroft, Bush's national security advisor, to begin planning civil defenses. Saddam Hussein's most likely use of germ weapons, he argued, would be through a surrogate, a terrorist group. White House officials quietly began assembling an emergency response team centered at the Department of Health and Human Services. The staffer who handled his meeting with Scowcroft was a rising young star named Condoleezza Rice, a Soviet specialist whom Lederberg had known when she was a student at Stanford. The preparations were modest, a training exercise or two and some antibiotics stockpiled in the Washington area. But Lederberg felt he had made a contribution. The nation's capital had been made somewhat less vulnerable to terrorist attack. America's top military commanders were beginning to understand the magnitude of the threat.
Briefed in late November about the lack of biological detectors, General Carl Viono, the Army Chief of Staff, was stunned that American troops would be used as canaries in a potentially lethal coal mine. That's an interesting thing to omit from the audiobook. General Carl Vuono, that's V-U-O-N-O, pushed the bugs and gas experts to tell him why the soldiers were the, quote, first indications of biological weapons agents' use, unquote. Wasn't there some other intelligence system or equipment that could warn of an impending attack? Vuono said that many countries might follow Iraq's example and acquire biological agents. The general said, quote, the United States should never be put into this position of not being able to vaccinate the force, unquote, he told a senior aide. The general demanded a, quote, long-term solution, unquote, a stockpile of vaccines, or some other idea. Interesting thing to omit.
In Riyadh, General Schwarzkopf felt trapped. He was persuaded that the biological threat was real, but the supplies of vaccine were well short of what was needed. Someone was going to have to play God by deciding who would be protected. Schwarzkopf believed such a decision should be made in Washington and kept pressing the Joint Chiefs to deliver enough vaccine to immunize everyone. It was a nightmare, he said years later. Schwarzkopf was also frustrated by the carefully worded assessments coming from the intelligence agencies. He needed facts, not surmises. What was Iraq's doctrine for using germ weapons? Did their missiles have germ warheads? The bugs and gas experts in Washington were chagrined by their own inability to provide clearer answers. But there was just not enough first-hand information available on a program that was one of Iraq's most closely guarded secrets. An October 22nd report by the Armed Forces Medical Intelligence Center was typical. Large quantities of anthrax bacteria and botulinum toxin likely have been produced, it said. We believe that these agents have been weaponized and that biological and toxin munitions already exist. The analyst mentioned another potentially disturbing bit of news. The Baghdad offices of a Chilean company that was supplying cluster bombs to Iraq had been overheard discussing the parameters for aerosol testing of botulinum toxin with the Home Office. Did this mean that Iraq had such a weapon? The analysts were not sure. The evidence they wrote would allow only the inferential assessment that the Iraqis were trying to buy such weapons, not that they had them. On the crucial question of what Iraq might do with its weapons in a war, its use doctrine, the experts admitted what Schwarzkopf already knew. There were significant intelligence gaps. Defense Intelligence Agency officials acknowledged there is no reliable information on how Iraq might use their BW weapons. The most suitable way is in a clandestine manner prior to the outset of hostilities. The impasse over when to begin inoculations continued, and Powell returned to the tank to confer with the chiefs of the 4 branches of the American military. Only the Navy supported immediate vaccination. A few days later, on October 21st, Charles Freeman, the American ambassador in Riyadh, raised his own objections. Vaccinating soldiers but not civilians was a bad idea, Freeman warned in a secret cable. It could sow panic, fracture the coalition. Besides, there were American citizens in the region working on oil projects. What about them? There would be a public relations disaster, Freeman warned, if the United States protected only its soldiers. Intelligence officials began trying to figure out what might prompt the Iraqi leader to use his germ weapons. If Saddam concluded his personal position was becoming hopeless, CIA analysts warned in November 1990, this could convince him to use biological weapons to shock the coalition into a ceasefire. In such a situation, the use of anthrax against a coalition military installation or major Saudi oil facility might seem an attractive option. Air Force officers drawing up Allied plans for a massive bombing of Iraq thought they could resolve some of the uncertainties about Baghdad's germ program with a few well-placed explosives. American intelligence had identified what it believed were Iraq's main research and production sites for biological weapons, as well as more than a dozen refrigerated bunkers. The analysts were not sure what Iraq was doing with the bunkers. Air Force officers designing the air campaign planned to demolish them and any other structures that might be linked to the Iraqi biological program. That stirred a new set of uncertainties among intelligence analysts back in Washington. No one was sure what would happen if you bombed a building or bunker packed with anthrax or botulinum. Would a plume of agents scatter illness and death across the region? Some preliminary calculations by yet another hastily assembled committee of experts, dubbed the Interagency Fusion Group, suggested that casualties inside Iraq could be staggering. Attacks on 10 separate sites in Iraq, they estimated, could kill more than 150,000 Iraqi civilians, more than the number of people killed by the Hiroshima bomb. The British weighed in with an equally gloomy assessment. General Charles Horner, the Riyadh-based American commander who was planning the air assault on Iraq, believed that the estimates were exaggerated. His aides proposed several ways of minimizing the risk. The bunkers could be hit with bombs that would cause them to implode rather than explode. Pilots could drop incendiary devices, creating a blast of heat that would kill the spores. The missions could be flown just before dawn so that if a plume of anthrax were inadvertently released, it would be weakened by the day's heat and light. In December 1990, Horner briefed Cheney and Powell on his plans for bombing the bunkers. He described the revised calculations of how much anthrax might waft across Iraq after a raid. "I can't promise you we are not going to have casualties in this," he told them. "There has got to be a penalty for a country that manufactures and stores these horrible weapons. So if there is a fallout, and if there are civilian casualties from this, maybe that point needs to be made to all the other countries who conceive to do this." A few weeks later, the Fusion Group acknowledged that it had miscalculated, and it revised its estimate of casualties sharply downward. Because they did not know where Iraq was hiding its germ weapons, the analysts had put together a worst-case forecast in which it was assumed that each site housed Iraq's entire arsenal. There was a second crucial mistake. The Fusion Group had initially estimated that 1% to 10% of the spores would survive an explosion and float into the air. Consultation with several veterans of the American Germ program, including Bill Patrick, suggested that the actual number would be much, much lower, less than 0.1%. The new analysis still offered sobering predictions. It said the Allied bombing was likely to cause hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Iraqi civilians to suffer painful, lingering deaths from inhaled anthrax. Senior officials weighed the risks, and assuming that was to be the cost of taking the biological option out of Saddam's hands forever, accepted them. The general whom Powell had assigned to work the vaccine issue, John Jumper, sent a message to Schwarzkopf in early December suggesting a way to stretch the limited vaccine supplies. A combination of doxycycline and vaccine had kept alive all the monkeys in the Fort Detrick study. The commanders could administer antibiotics to all 500,000 troops and keep the vaccine in reserve to treat anyone attacked with anthrax. Jumper's cable puzzled Schwarzkopf's medical officers. Anthrax multiplies rapidly in the body, and the researchers had begun treating the monkeys within a day of exposure. Because the detector problem remained unsolved, the first signs of exposure could appear days later, when soldiers began complaining of flu. Sending troops on antibiotics into battle was risky, Schwarzkopf's medical advisors felt. The drug recommended in the cable, ciprofloxacin, was a powerful antibiotic that sometimes caused serious diarrhea and other side effects. It also killed normal bacteria in the gut, leaving only resistant germs. A soldier shot in the stomach would stand a greater chance of contracting an untreatable infection. The doctors met with Schwarzkopf on December 6 to review Jumper's cable. Colonel James David Bales, Jr., an infectious disease specialist assigned to CENTCOM just a few days after the invasion of Kuwait, leaned over the commander and watched his eyes flicker across the page. As Schwarzkopf read the passage about the need to administer the vaccine and Cipro within 24 hours, Bales said, "And how are you going to know that?" The more experienced officers in the room braced for an explosion. Schwarzkopf hated interruptions, but he agreed with Bales. The antibiotic approach was too risky without reliable detectors. The next day, Schwarzkopf sent a private, eyes-only message to Powell rejecting the widespread use of antibiotics. He preferred to vaccinate, even if there was not enough for everyone. A decision to immunize, he reiterated, had serious implications for the coalition and could be made only in Washington. The impasse frustrated Colonel George E. Lewis, a microbiologist who was working for Jumper and helped prepare the cable on antibiotics. Military officers made life-and-death decisions every day. They calculated how many men would be sent to attack a particular target, or how much air cover was required for dangerous operations. Why was it so hard to decide whom to protect against biological attack? The January 15th deadline set by the United Nations for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait was just 5 weeks away, and Lewis knew the Allies had already waited too long. To obtain even partial immunity, inoculations should have begun in mid-November. Each day's delay raised the danger. The Pentagon calculated that soldiers who received their first shots on December 10th would not be minimally protected against anthrax until January 21st, and against botulism until April 1st. Project Badger's efforts to make more vaccine had fallen well short. The Michigan lab had produced enough anthrax vaccine to protect about 150,000 of the 500,000 American troops in the region. There was none to share with allies or American civilians in Saudi Arabia. Defenses against botulism were even more limited. Despite considerable effort, not a single additional dose had been produced. There was still only enough for 10,000 soldiers. On December 9th, the British added to the pressure. General Peter de la Billière met with Schwarzkopf in Riyadh and told him that he intended to begin immunizing his troops unless the United States had strenuous objections. British officials, unlike the Americans, believed Iraq had turned anthrax and plague into weapons, and they intended to protect their troops against both. The British bought an American vaccine against plague that was still experimental and was known to cause temporary but debilitating flu-like side effects. The Saudis learned of the British plans and asked Schwarzkopf whether he would provide some anthrax vaccine to protect their troops. The American commander said he did not have enough for his own soldiers. A senior Saudi general asked whether Washington could at least set aside some shots for the royal family. It was an awkward request. Saudi Arabia's willingness to allow American forces on its soil had made Operation Desert Storm possible, but Schwarzkopf had none to share. On December 10th, Schwarzkopf called Powell on a secure phone to rehash the decision to bomb the biological bunkers and production plants. He told the chairman that it would be an unforgivable sin not to attack the germ targets. It was the only way to guarantee that the weapons would not be used. Schwarzkopf began to plan who would be immunized with the limited supplies. Months earlier, he had asked his chief medical officer, Colonel Robert Belahar, and other top aides to assess how and where Iraq might attack with germs. "Think as Saddam Hussein would," he told him. Belahar said he lacked information. Would the Iraqis use anthrax as an aerosol, or would they pour botulism into the water supplies? Would they spread germs on the front lines or use it as a terror weapon in the United States? A key question was whether Iraq had vaccinated its soldiers against anthrax or other agents. The Americans arranged for blood samples to be taken from Iraqi deserters being held by Saudi Arabia. The blood was flown to Fort Detrick for analysis in early December. Schwarzkopf and his aides eventually concluded that anthrax would most likely be aimed at rear areas. A germ weapon that takes effect over several days, they reasoned, would not be very useful in a frontal assault. Botulism dissipates quickly and was thus a threat to the forward positions. Schwarzkopf was trying to make the best of a bad situation. It was entirely possible that his guesses were wrong, that the Iraqis would use anthrax against the front lines. If that happened, there would hardly be any vaccine left to treat those who were ill. His proposal for rationing the vaccine stirred up inter-service rivalries. At a meeting of Air Force generals in December, one officer complained that the recommendations by Schwarzkopf, an Army general, reflected an infantryman's concerns for his fellow infantrymen. The Air Force had done its own analysis, which concluded its crews would be a primary target for germ weapons. Air Force officers drew up a list of 30,000 airmen who should be vaccinated.
So the year here is 1990, and the talk is really nothing except anthrax vaccine. So I'm going to the U.S. newspapers, and I'm searching for the phrase anthrax vaccine, and I'm find the newest stuff first, which means from December, and then on backwards. I'm just curious what the articles say. Michigan to make anthrax vaccine for troops. I have found some of these articles before. Vaccinating against germ warfare agent, a long shot. I don't know if there were any other potential candidate vaccine technologies. I'm just wondering if someone threw out the idea that maybe there's other ways to vaccinate. Now, clearly that was the case for 2001, but in 1990, I never really considered that. In fact, until listening to this book again, it didn't really dawn upon me how much the vaccine issue was, even all the way back in 1990. So 1991, there's very few mentions at all of the phrase anthrax vaccine. So they talk about, this is 1991, Atlanta Journal. There's an article here. The vaccine shortage will delay widespread vaccinations until the Pentagon requested that the health department step up production about a month ago. Michigan, this is what became Bioport factory up in Michigan, produced just 1,000 to 3,000 doses of anthrax and botulism vaccine a year, officials said. The United States Army has also asked, this is important, guys, the Salk Institute for Biological Studies at La Jolla, California, to produce a botulism vaccine. Now, that's interesting. The Salk Institute in La Jolla is very, very, very close to where Vical Corporation is. And in fact,
a December 11th assessment prepared by Army health officials outlined 3 possible approaches. Course of action number 1 was to begin vaccinating U.S. troops as quickly as possible. This would have a favorable domestic reception and could deter Iraq. Course of action number 2 was to share the limited supplies with allies, which would promote perception of shared risk, support the unity of the alliance, and might dissuade Baghdad from using germ weapons. The third option was to defer vaccinations until there was enough on hand for a comprehensive program while sharing the antibiotics with allies. This would heighten the dangers for everyone, but the shared risk would promote Allied unity and keep on hand a supply of vaccine in case of attack. Pentagon officials wrote that the last approach offered another benefit. It will temper media reaction. On December 17, 1990, Powell finally delivered his recommendations to Secretary Cheney, calling for inoculations to begin immediately. It had been 4 months since the Pentagon's medical experts had made the same proposal, months in which the service chiefs and other top military and civilian officials had undergone a crash course in the science, tactics, and ambiguities of biological warfare.
All right, I wanted to add some additional backstory here about Dick Cheney in the year 1990. If we go to Houstonic Live and click on the L's, and we're going to go to our page for Joshua Lederberg, which has a lot, but is still woeful compared to how much content is out there, and deservingly so, for Joshua Lederberg. And I think the page I have for his wife, first wife Esther, is even more sad compared to how much she did. So here's a letter from the United States Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, directly to Joshua Lederberg on February 26, 1990, stating, Dear Dr. Joshua Lederberg, as your term as member-at-large of the Defense Science Board comes to a close, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you personally for your service. The board feels an important role in providing me with independent, objective advice that greatly assists in our responsibility to assure a sound defense program. So a working relationship actually evolved with Lederberg and Dick Cheney. I don't know the full extent of it. We also know that here's Joshua Lederberg there at this particular meeting in Russia regarding Russia's stockpiles of biological weapons. This is from the National Libraries of Medicine. This is in 1991. Joshua Lederberg and the rest of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control, the CISAC, delegation attending a Moscow meeting. But here is 1994, March 27th. Procter & Gamble Company, one of the larger United States companies, on their board of directors, one of their larger shareholders was actually Dr. Joshua Lederberg. At the time, he was 68 years old. Against the 1994 article, president of Rockefeller University. Lederberg had 13,000 common shares at that time. And Lederberg's relationship with Dick Cheney actually led to Dick Cheney getting onto the board of Procter & Gamble at that time. So Cheney, of course, was no longer Secretary of Defense in 1994, but he was also starting to make a lot of money with Halliburton, I believe, around that time. It lists him at that time as the senior fellow of the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. He only had 400 shares or so. Lederberg had so many relationships, it's hard to even rank them. So simply saying that, hey, they spent some time together is a little bit irresponsible to suggest that it was a primary or a very strong relationship. But nonetheless, there was several shared bonds between Cheney and Joshua Lederberg. Also noteworthy, and of course this book won't cover it, the Germs book, because it was published September 7th or 9th of 2001. But after September 11th, 2001, and sometime in the later September, maybe early October, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at that time, and of course Dick Cheney at that time was Vice President, started an internal Pentagon investigation regarding multiple aspects about biological warfare and the events of September 11th, and actually put Joshua Lederberg in charge of that, a civilian, effectively, at that time. So I don't know how much this book talks or builds upon, expands upon what is known about the relationship between Dick Cheney and Joshua Lederberg, but it's noteworthy that it existed to the point where I even think that Lederberg got Cheney onto the board of directors of Procter & Gamble in the early 1990s.
On December 17, 1990, Powell finally delivered his recommendations to Secretary Cheney, calling for inoculations to begin immediately. It had been 4 months since the Pentagon's medical experts had made the same proposal, months in which the service chiefs and other top military and civilian officials had undergone a crash course in the science, tactics, and ambiguities of biological warfare. Cheney and Powell took their plan to the White House. At the table were President George Bush and several of his top aides. Some were surprised by the seriousness with which the Pentagon presented the Iraqi biological threat. Was it really likely that the Iraqis would use such weapons? What were the risks of the vaccines? White House officials had made a pact among themselves. They would not micromanage. They would not overrule the commanders on purely military issues. The president approved the plan without revisions. I'll be honest. If I had been making the decision on the anthrax, I probably would not have used it, Brent Scowcroft, Bush's national security advisor, said in a recent interview. I didn't object to it if the military thought it was the thing to do, but I probably would not have recommended it. As Powell's aides were drafting the memo outlining the vaccination program, the Pentagon received an encouraging bit of news. The blood samples taken from detained Iraqi deserters showed no sign of immunizations against anthrax or botulinum. Schwarzkopf's medical team did not feel particularly relieved. The Iraqi soldiers in Saudi hands were conscripts, cannon fodder, whom Iraqi generals would view as expendable. Perhaps Saddam Hussein had vaccinated his elite troops, the Republican Guard. Maybe the Iraqis would attack the front lines with germs, killing both the unvaccinated Iraqi conscripts and the Americans. Back in Washington, the Army was pressing the FDA to permit it to give the botulinum vaccine to soldiers without obtaining the informed consent normally required for patients given experimental unapproved drugs. Botulinum's effects were felt within hours of exposure, which meant the weapon might be useful in an attack on frontline troops. There would be no time for medical niceties, military officials argued. The FDA reluctantly agreed. By December 29th, Powell notified Schwarzkopf that the decision had finally been made to immunize the troops against anthrax and botulinum. Days later, Schwarzkopf reviewed the plan for rationing the vaccine with his top aides and demanded some changes, overruling a proposal to give botulinum shots to officers at the Riyadh headquarters. What little vaccine there was, he thought, should be reserved for frontline troops. Schwarzkopf also said every soldier assigned to receive the experimental drug should be given a release form to read and sign. Anyone who wanted to refuse the shot could do so. In early January 1991, teams of medics began immunizing the troops against anthrax and botulinum. Every soldier was also issued a 5-day supply of Cipro. A Marine Corps medical official told General James M. Myatt, the leader of the 1st Marine Division, that there were only 7,000 doses of anthrax vaccine for the 22,000 soldiers under his command. Like Schwarzkopf, Myatt was reluctant to play God. If there was not enough vaccine to go around, nobody would get it. Adherence to Schwarzkopf's orders on the botulinum vaccine was spotty. Some soldiers were given the shot without being told what it was. To quell fears about the vaccines, Schwarzkopf himself took an anthrax shot. "Just make sure that I'm one of those 9 monkeys that survived," he told the medics. Detectors were still a major headache. By December, senior Army officials had devised a plan to use an untried laser-based technology to detect germ attacks. The Los Alamos National Laboratory had been experimenting with airborne lasers that might be able to pick up the release of an aerosol cloud. The lasers were to be placed aboard C-130 aircraft that would fly continuously over the Gulf. Schwarzkopf's second-in-command, General Cal Waller, hated the idea. "Thanks for your proposed deployment of experimental developmental BW defense assets," Waller wrote to the Pentagon. "The fielding of a fully supported system of operational worth on such short notice is ambitious." Waller said he was reluctant to divert his limited intelligence aircraft from priority missions to an untried, uncertain system of biological defense. The Air Force also hated the plan, fearing that the lasers might blind pilots. They were not deployed. Instead, the Army relied on a dozen detectors its technicians had improvised. The system was built around a sniffer that forced huge quantities of air into a liquid reservoir. Servicemen would test for biological attack by dipping specially treated paper into the liquid at regular intervals. In theory, the paper would change color in the presence of suspect microbes, such as the anthrax bacillus. Then the liquid would be tested with more sensitive lab equipment. No one had much confidence in the system. On December 9th, Schwarzkopf spoke with Powell by secure phone and suggested a bold tactic to avert biological attack. The United States should announce that it would severely punish Saddam Hussein if he used his chemical or biological weapons. Powell said he was pressing the White House to warn Iraq that the United States would use its own unconventional weapons if Iraq attacked with chemicals, a reference to nuclear retaliation. The consensus among Bush and his top national security aides, known as the Gang of Eight, was against such retaliation. Washington was trying to hold together a fragile coalition that included Iraq's Arab neighbors. Bush made his preferences clear. He would not be the second president in American history to order a nuclear strike. If the United States needed to punish Iraq, it would expand its conventional bombing campaign. The decision was kept secret. On January 9, 1991, Secretary of State Baker flew to Geneva to give Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister, a letter from President Bush to Saddam Hussein. The White House had decided against threatening Iraq with nuclear attack. "Your country," the letter said, "will pay a terrible price if you order unconscionable acts." Aziz refused to accept the letter, and Baker, taking an expansive view of his instructions, set out to persuade the Iraqis that the United States was poised for nuclear retaliation. "God forbid," he said, "chemical or biological weapons are used against our forces. The American people would demand revenge." Baker added, "This is not a threat." The president's inclination against a nuclear strike was hypothetical, and Pentagon officials who had done some preliminary planning of nuclear options believed that they could reopen the issue if Saddam Hussein did the unthinkable. The day after a biological strike, political pressure would force any president to reassess. "If we had a loss of 200,000 soldiers, how could we not nuke them?" asked Larry Sequist, whose report for the Pentagon's top policy officials had raised the specter of such losses. Scowcroft acknowledged that the issue would have been revisited if Americans had died in a germ attack, but he added that he would have adamantly opposed nuclear retaliation. Scowcroft said he would have strongly argued for changing the aims of the war to, say, toppling Saddam Hussein. Using atomic weapons against Iraq would have been, in his words, another case where it's okay against the Japanese, okay against the Arabs, not against white folk. In January 1991, as the Allies prepared for the ground war that would culminate with the invasion of Kuwait, Schwarzkopf's aides confronted a grisly question. If soldiers were killed by a germ attack, what should the military do with their remains? Botulinum toxin decays rapidly, so victims of that microbe could be buried in temporary graves and then exhumed for internment in the United States. Anthrax, with its highly persistent spores, was another matter. The presence of living anthrax spores in the remains can only be confidently excluded if the bodies are incinerated, a memo from Fort Detrick said. If that was not possible, the remains would have to be soaked in a powerful bleach to kill all the spores. The bones could then be flown back to the United States for burial with minimal risk to morticians. In the days before the air war began, President Bush grew increasingly anxious about Iraq's biological arsenal. On January 13th, he asked Powell to review the plans for bombing the refrigerated bunkers. What were the risks? Was it worth it? Powell reassured the president that the bombing would probably destroy the Germ agents. Some might be released, but it was a gamble we had to take. In his memoirs, Powell wrote that Bush was already agitated, and this added worry did not soothe him. 2 days later, the chief of the British Defense Staff, Air Vice Marshal Sir David Craig, called with the same questions. "Bit risky, that, eh?" Craig remarked. Powell said he believed that the benefits outweighed the costs. "If it heads south," he told Craig, "just blame me." The United Nations deadline expired on January 15th. Officials later said that in the meeting in which President Bush sent American forces to war against Baghdad, he had only two concerns: a last-minute diplomatic move by France and the threat from biological weapons. At 1:30 a.m. on January 16th, the first Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from vessels in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, marking the start of the largest sustained bombing campaign in the history of warfare. In Washington, the officials who had tried to build a credible defense against biological attack held their breath. Sequist believed that the United States' best defense was Iraq's fear of nuclear retaliation. But the Bush administration had undermined that strategy in the weeks leading up to the war. While administration spokesmen studiously maintained the ambiguity, Vice President Dan Quayle said that he could not imagine the president ordering a nuclear strike. The next day, Quayle said, "We don't rule options in or out." Iraq's air defenses were destroyed in the first days of the war, and Allied bombers pounded what intelligence officials believed were the key biological targets. Salman Pak, a research facility where intelligence analysts suspected that Iraq had begun its nuclear program and done some germ experiments, was leveled. Nearly all of the refrigerated bunkers were slammed with high explosives. On January 21st, the pursuit of biological targets became a major public relations problem for the Allied coalition as bombers slammed a factory in Abu Ghraib that intelligence officials believed was a backup plant for germ production. Iraq said the factory produced infant formula, and CNN's Peter Arnett was taken to the site for a tour and the chance to broadcast pictures of a container bearing, in English, the notation baby milk. Replying to some skeptical questioning from Schwarzkopf's aides after the raid, intelligence officials said they had spotted little day-to-day activity at the plant since it had opened in 1983. It produced little baby milk and was camouflaged just prior to the war, suggesting to the American analysts who were picking the targets that it was linked to biological warfare. The connection of the factory to biological weapons remains controversial. American intelligence officials scoured the region for signs of a biological release, particularly on the days after germ-related targets were hit. The DIA reported after the bombing of Salman Pak that there had been no outbreak of disease in Baghdad. Allied bombers hit another suspected germ facility at Taji on January 21st in a raid that American officials had feared could release as much as 500 grams of anthrax, killing as many as 5,000 people in Baghdad. It has been 3 days since the attack, the report noted, and casualties should already have started. The findings were immediately reported to Cheney. It looked like the Allied bombing was not going to unleash a plague on the Middle East. There were some anxious moments. A half-dozen British soldiers stationed near the front lines reported flu-like symptoms. They were sent to a Saudi hospital and closely monitored. Their symptoms, it turned out, were caused by the flu. The bulky detectors picked up several signs of anthrax and botulinum, all of which were found to be false alarms. The ground attack was ready to go, and Saddam Hussein was running out of time to use his ultimate weapons.
And this concludes the end of Chapter 4, titled Saddam, in the September 7th, 2001 original version of the book Germs by Judith Miller. It ends on page 178, and in the current Amazon audiobook, as of today at least, April 17th, 2025, the audio that corresponds to the end of Chapter 4 is in Chapter 3 at minute 16 and 51 seconds. There's several paragraphs that I observed in Chapter 4 that are in a different order in the audiobook And I suspect that it's actually a better told story with that different ordering. So I'm going to leave that as is. I'd like to add the observation that Chapter 4 so far has been the one chapter that has been the least modified by the audiobook. I probably no more than 5 or 10% of it was omitted and required additional narrating, compared to other chapters which were 30% and as high as 40% of missing narration in the audiobook, which required me to narrate it for the purposes of this recording. It's noteworthy that this mostly corresponds to the events of 1991, which were already pretty much well documented and set in stone, of course, by 10 years later. And that concludes episode 280.4. The next episode, 280.5, will cover Chapter 5 in the book titled Secrets and Lies, which begins on page 179. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the supporters of Houstonic.live. Contributions are supported monthly on Patreon, if possible, or one time on PayPal. We also have a P.O. Box 505, Southborough, Massachusetts, 01772. And this information is all available on Houstonic.live, the website, under the support drop-down menu. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, wonderful positive day. Love you guys very much. Catch you again soon.
I used to be a rolling stone, you know.
Odd song to play during a chapter titled Saddam. But I have an odd sense of humor.